Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In this module, we are going to be talking about the concept of governance and, by implication or extension, corporate governance. What exactly is corporate governance, and why do we have to tie it with compliance? I think, let me respond to the last question. Why do we have to tie corporate governance to compliance? It is the simple fact that if you have a good corporate or sound corporate governance in your organization or framework, for instance, and the organization is not complying with the set of rules and processes of corporate governance that has been put in place, then that corporate governance will fail. So the emphasis is that if we have corporate governance architecture, we need to comply with the framework. And I think that's an important point. Well, let's now take us through what is corporate governance. But before we do that, let us look at the outline of this presentation. So that is the outline. We start with what is governance, and by extension, what is corporate governance? What are the guiding principles of good corporate governance? What is corporate constitution and governance structures? Then we progress into discussing the issue of the duties and responsibilities of directors. And finally, we'll conclude with the need to protect stakeholder interest. In other words, the whole essence of corporate governance is to protect stakeholder interest. But how do we do all of that? At the end of this presentation, if you're there listening to me, you should be able to understand the concept of governance and corporate governance, recognize the guiding principles of corporate governance, grasp the concept of corporate constitution and governance structures, appreciate the duties and responsibilities of directors, and finally, you should be able to comprehend how to protect stakeholder interests. So let's go. Now, what is governance actually? The World Bank defines governance as the framework or the manner in which power is exercised in the management of a country's economic and social resources for development. A country, that means we're taking governance at the country level, but you can then bring it down to the corporate level. The 2009 Global Monitoring Report sees governance as power relationships, formal and informal processes of formulating policies and allocating resources. It goes further to say that it has to do with processes of decision-making and, of course, mechanisms for holding governments accountable. So in essence, we'll say that governance is about the culture and the institutional environment in which the players or the actors in a particular setting in an organization interact among themselves and participate in the affairs of the organization. Finally, governance is about how power is distributed and shared, how policies are formulated, priorities set, and stakeholders made accountable. I think we need to underline those last few words: priorities set and stakeholders made accountable. So corporate governance is about accountability. It's about complying with the processes and structures by which organizations are governed. So this schematic is what describes what we just talked about. You find that control and risk management methods and systems, this is at the heart of good corporate governance. It's at the heart. Corporate governance is about taking decisions, and taking those decisions, you need to take into account the processes, the behaviors, the ethics and social, accountability and responsibility, ethical practices, legislative compliance, rules and regulations, and then of course the issues of reporting. So you find all of these, interact, in such a way that, it defines what the corporate governance landscape looks like in any particular organization. But the starting point really for good corporate governance is to come up with policies and business rules and structures and control processes standards well established and embedded in such organizations in order to create the fillip and the platform for an effective corporate governance practice in every organization. That's very important. So corporate governance, we've talked about governance just in broad terms, but corporate governance now, that is governance as it relates to organizations and corporations, involves the balancing of interest of a company's many stakeholders. Of course, there are many stakeholders, and these stakeholders include the shareholders, the senior management executive, the staff in those organizations, the customers, suppliers, financiers, the government, and the community. All of these are the stakeholders. So corporate governance is about balancing all of these interests, and some of these interests can be contending. That is why we talked about contending interests. So good governance, corporate governance is established to make sure that it provides the guidance and the framework for balancing all of these interests. You can as well say that corporate governance is the system by which companies are directed and controlled. That's very true. Of course, we all know that the board of directors is responsible for the governance of their companies. They have overall oversight over what happens in such, such organizations, and they have responsibilities. They are accountable. Of course, it also ensuring that the values of the company are kept intact. Corporate governance is the collection of the mechanisms and the processes of relations by which corporations and organizations are controlled and operated. Now, we move forward. All of this tries to speak to the whole concept of corporate, governance. But one point we need to take from this slide is that interest in the corporate governance practices of modern corporations actually, particularly in relation to accountability, increased following high-profile collapses of a number of large corporations in the US and some other countries in the early part of 2000. Many of these failures involved accounting fraud, and then again, after the recent financial crisis in 2008, it's been found out that it is the lack or the absence of good corporate governance that led to the failures of these organizations. And that is why there is now increasing interest in corporate governance. So this is the corporate governance, and these are the various stakeholders. The stakeholders can be broken down into two: the internal stakeholders, and then of course the external stakeholders. So balancing the interests of all of these stakeholders is what corporate governance is all about. The key drivers of corporate governance and what you find in this schematic, you find it's about the culture, the values, the people, the rules, the environment, the structures, the processes. And when all of these drivers, all of these players are interact in such a way to produce very good results in terms of performance, accountability, risk management, and then of course it leads to overall long-term success. The point is good corporate governance should not be seen from a compliance mentality. Rather, it should be seen that in the longer term, good corporate governance leads to success. It produces very positive results for every organization and should therefore be embraced, happily and totally. So what are the guiding principles of good corporate governance? Some of the principles, we're going to list them, is that the board should be the one to approve corporate strategies that are intended to build sustainable long-term value. The board has a key role to play. So that is one principle. The board must drive corporate governance. Management, the second principle, that management should develop and implement corporate strategy and operate the company's business under the board's oversight. So management should develop and they should implement after they have obtained the approval of the board of directors. Of course, management under the oversight of the board and its audit committee should be able to produce financial statements that are fairly representative of the company's financial position or condition. And of course, the audit committee of the board should retain and manage the relationship with the outside auditor. That is a key principle that must be taken into account. The whole essence of this is to ensure the independence of the audit function. Then, of course, again, the nominating corporate governance committee of the board is to play a leadership role in shaping corporate governance. In other words, every company must have a nominating or corporate governance committee to drive the process. That is one principle. And of course, the compensation committee also needs to be set up to develop an executive compensation philosophy, adopt and oversee the implementation of compensation policy. This is to make sure that people who run the business, who run the organization, don't pay huge sums of money to themselves in the absence of a compensation committee. It's very, very important. We've seen that as a result, during the global financial crisis, many corporate leaders, managers were paying huge sums of money even when those companies were already in very serious dire situation. The board and management should engage with long-term shareholders on issues of concerns that are of widespread interest to them and that affect the company's long-term value creation. This engagement is important. It's a guiding principle whereby they have to engage, the board and management. They should engage regularly. And of course, in making decisions, the board should consider the interests of all the company's constituencies, all the stakeholders that we saw in the last slide, that is both internal and external stakeholders. So the board has to make sure that all of these constituencies are carried along in such a way that everybody is aware, everybody is taken along, everybody is on board, so that together, the company is taken to its destination. So we can now begin to cascade the principles, and the corporate governance framework needs to reflect the culture, the style, and issues of the organization, and therefore there cannot be a one-size fits all. Some of these principles include honesty, transparency, accountability, responsibility, independence, fairness, and social responsibility. So both the board and the management of corporations must ensure that these principles guide everything that they want to do in respect of managing organizations and corporations. So in terms of the structures, the policy and the governance structure must first of all be articulated, must be put in place. So every organization needs to have the structure. The structure is the framework, and where you do not have structure, good corporate governance cannot take place. So the governance structures can be put into two basic categories: the policy boards, and then of course administrative boards. And it is this structure that will drive all of the systems and processes in the respective organizations. Now, let's look at the constitution and corporate structure in more details. If you take a hard look at this framework, you'll find that the stakeholders, they are the top of the structure, which meaning that, a board must be able to carry all of the stakeholders along. So you have the various stakeholders, government and regulatory agencies, business partners and investors, shareholders, employees, and the community. So the governance framework revolves around all of these stakeholders, and the board has a responsibility, to be able to ensure that these various stakeholders are managed in such a way that everybody is happy and carried along. Of course, the board has overall oversight, but it is the responsibility of management, to make sure that the decisions of the board are carried along. And the board, functions through various committees. We have the Audit and Risk Management Committee, Remuneration and Nomination Committee, and then of course the Finance, Committee. So everything has to be cascaded down in order to create a corporate culture and value system that will drive the operations of the organization. So what are the duties and responsibilities of directors? This is fairly well known, but let's just mention a couple of them. The directors are required to attain a balance between competing interests of shareholders, customers, lenders, promoters, and directors. That's a huge responsibility. They should be able to ensure the company's prosperity by collectively directing the company's affairs. The board of directors should provide counsel and oversight on the selection, evaluation, development, and compensation of senior management. The board should monitor corporate performance against strategic business plans. The board should ensure that processes are in place for maintaining the integrity of the company by way of the financial statements. The board of directors should ensure that the company is in compliance with all applicable statutory and legal requirements. The board should ensure an efficient, efficient business events that would spell success or lead to disaster. They'll be able to anticipate that. The board should also meet regularly. Directors should exhibit total commitment to the company. Is that board should steer discussions properly. The director is expected to have the courage of conviction to disagree. Directors should have great responsibility in the matter of employment and dismissal, and so on and so forth. These are very huge duties and responsibilities of directors. And these duties are done in such a way as to ensure good corporate governance practices in various organizations. Now, talking about protection of stakeholder interest. The reason for this is because of the agency principal relationship. An agent, acts on behalf of the principal. So the principal here, they are the shareholders, the firm owners, they hire the managers. So how you manage that kind of a relationship? How do you ensure that managers will act in the best interest of the shareholders? And that is the whole essence of good corporate governance. So you need to put in place solid corporate governance architecture in order to be able to have a situation, create a very robust agency relationship in such a way as to manage, to the barest minimum friction between the principal and the agent. So the protection of stakeholder interests is very key and fundamental to good corporate governance practices. And here we need to be very clear that while all stakeholder interests are very, very key, the minority interest is where attention is often focused. Because to the extent that they do not have much of the shares of the company, there is likely a tendency for those who have majority shareholding to lord it over the minority interest. And so good corporate governance ensures that all stakeholder interests are managed and taken care of. The internal stakeholders, we have mentioned that all of these internal stakeholders need to be protected, as well as the external stakeholders. We have shown this already, but just for the purpose of emphasis, when we're talking about stakeholder interests, we're talking about both the internal stakeholders and also the external stakeholders, including the customers of the company. So this also emphasizes it. There has to be a deliberate campaign to ensure that all stakeholder interests are managed and taken care of. The role of the media is very key here. And in some organizations, they have a separate unit or function that ensures that all the interests of stakeholders are properly managed. So that's it. I want to thank you very much for listening to this presentation on corporate governance. If you like this, please share it. Also, you should also like the post, subscribe to my channel. That way, we'll be working together and ensuring that this knowledge is built across from time to time. Thank you very much, and please stay blessed.